Welcome to the second video of this to-do list application project. And in the last video we have created the list, and in this video you can see I have added some stylings to our to-do list. See this styling here like that. So I wrote some CSS for this styling, and you can find this CSS file inside description or the code on GitHub, right? And I have imported this CSS inside the root file of our task list component. You can see here. So you can do the same. So now our next task is to implement this remove button. So whenever a user clicks on this remove button, so this specific item should be removed from the list. We can achieve that. You see, whenever some user will click on this, we need to identify the ID of this specific item which needs to be removed, right? And for that I have added the ID key inside this every object of our tasks array, right? So whenever some user click on this remove button, we need to fetch that ID, and we can remove that specific ID element from this array, right? So now you notice one thing, that we can fetch the ID only inside this list item component. And as you see, this list item component is the child component of this index of this list, and this list is the child component of index component. And then we are using this index component inside our main app component. So you can see here, for better understanding, we have our app component, and this app component has two child components. One is header. So we have nothing with header, and we only need to do all the logic with this task list component, right? And this task list component has the root component is this index.js file, and then index.js file has some child list component like list.jsx, you can see here. And this list.jsx, we have a child component that is list item. So in the past video you have seen how we are passing the data between some components, like from a parent component to a child component, and we were using the props for doing the same, right? But in this scenario we need to fetch the ID from this element on this component, and we need to use that ID inside our app component, because we only have our list array inside our app component. Logic is, we need to pass the data from a child component to a parent component, and this is the special concept in React that is called lifting the state up. You can see here. So in this task list component we have our state, like which item to be removed. We need to fetch that item ID, and we need to pass this item ID to our app.js so that we can remove that specific item ID element from this array. So for achieving that, we need to pass this task ID from this component first to its parent, like to list, and then to index, and then we need to pass that from index to app.js, right? Because we cannot directly pass data from a child component to this app component, because these components are not communicating directly. These are communicating via two components, that is index and list, right? That how we can do this, but for now our first task is to fetch the ID. Whenever some user clicks on this button, we need to fetch that ID inside the specific only in this list item component, right? And how we can do that? We need to add an event listener inside our button component or our button element. So I am adding that on click. Whenever a user click on this, something will happen. So what will happen? I am defining a variable or a function here using arrow function, that is, I can name it like remove handler, and I'm defining it, and here I'm logging my ID of this specific element. Whenever user is clicking on this, I'm adding the remove handler on this on click event. So whenever user will click on this button, so this function will be triggered, right? So now let's see is our application is working. So you can see whenever I'm clicking on this remove, so id is logged into the console. You can see here, right? So now we need to pass this id. We don't need our id here inside this component. We need our id in this app.js component. Passing our id from this to app.js, first need to pass this to its parent component, that is list component. And in this, let's create a function here that remove id, and I'm saying id, and I'm adding console.log id. Now we can pass our functions or any data via props to its child component. So we can pass this function to its child component, right? Like the same we are passing name, date and id. So let's pass this like on remove handler, and I'm saying remove id. And so why I have added this on, because whenever something it just means that whenever something happens on this list item, so this function will be triggered, right? And let's fetch this prop inside our list item. So here I'm fetching this via props. So what we named here, that is on remove handler. So let's fetch this prop here, and I'm saying here on remove handler, and I'm passing the id, right? So let's see, whenever I'm clicking on any remove button, so you can see here it is logging, but it is logging on list.jsx. So you have seen how we can pass the data from a child component to a parent component, but it is not done yet. We need to pass this data to not its parent component, but we need to pass this to app.js component. So how we can do that? We can pass it from, first we need to create a function on app.js, and then we can pass that function to the index.js, and then from index.js to list.js, and so on, right? Instead of using this function here, I am adding this function inside my app.js component, right? And in this task list, I am sending it via prop on remove handler, remove id, and let me fetch this prop inside my task list. And where is my task list root component? Is here, right? Tasks and on remove handler, and let's pass it from index.js to list component. On remove handler, I'm naming the same, and we have now this inside our list.jsx component, and from this I need to pass it on remove handler, and this is here, and it's saying all things are same. Now let's click on something, let me refresh it, and so you can see I got my id inside my app.js component, right? And now our next step is to implement the logic for removing this id specific element from this task array, right? Let's modify our remove id function, and now we need to use a specific hook inside my app.js component, and that is use state, so we can manage state using use state, right? And so be aware, if you are using use state, it is imported from React in your app.js component. And I am saying my initial state is tasks, or we can define directly this array, but I am defining this variable, that is tasks. And now my all task is set to this specific array, but I can modify it using set all tasks, right? And here I am sending all tasks. Now you can see the list is same because I've added this initial state inside my task list, right? And now let's modify this remove id handler function. We don't need now to log our id. Now what we need to do is we need to delete this id specific element from this tasks array, right? Using that, we need to remove or filter this array from this id specific element. So let's create a new variable or array. I'm saying new list, and I'm adding that all tasks dot filter item dot id should not be equal to id, right? And let's set this as new state here, right? Now let's see what is happening in our application. So whenever I am clicking on any remove button, it is being removed. You can see here, right? It is working completely fine. And let me refresh it so we can get a list ready. But because we have already added our initial state as this, but in the next video I will show you how you can create a form or input here so you can add a new task and remove interactivity you have implemented already, right? So we'll meet in the next video and I will show you how to implement that input component and we can add our new tasks to our to-do list app. And for now, this is all, and thank you for watching the video.